Hello again, Deirdre here. We're back to our second part on our talk about the Irish Impressionists. So the next artist we're going to look at is Roderick O'Connor, and as you can see already immediately from this painting that I have up here, you can see the influence of the post-impressionists on O'Connor's work. So as we know, the post-impressionists would be Gauguin, Cézanne and Vincent van Gogh. So O'Connor was born in Roscommon in 1860 and died in France in 1940. He spent the vast majority of his mature career in France. His time there may, broadly speaking, be divided into two parts. The first part was spent by and large in Brittany from 1891 onwards. The second was spent mostly in Paris from 1904 to 1933. By the beginning of the 1890s, O'Connor had moved to Point-Aven. In all probability, O'Connor was enticed there by the work of Gauguin and his followers, because as you know, Gauguin had a kind of an artist colony there in Point-Aven. It seems likely that O'Connor would have seen the work of the post-impressionists in Paris. He had already visited Point-Aven in 1887 and was aware of its potential as a location and of the potential of Breton culture as a subject matter. Indeed, he was probably aware of the area's suitability as a location for painting even before he left Ireland. Breton subjects were common in the work of the previous generation of Irish painters who had exhibited in the Royal Hibernian Academy. O'Connor would surely have seen these pictures during his studies in Dublin. This painting, houses at Les Avants in 1898, is ranked among the most important Irish paintings of the modern era. This would have been a precursor to those surrealists and cubists that have subsequently become renowned or known in Irish art, such as Mamie Jellett and Mary Swansea, etc. The surreal colouring of the pink, red and orange buildings in front of a green sky creates an extraordinary painting which predates the Expressionists and the Fauves by almost a decade. So when we think of the Fauves, we think of the work of Henri Matisse, and the colours that he used in his work are represented here in O'Connor's painting. The argument for O'Connor's place amongst the first Expressionists is strengthened by the fact that the Les Avants painting is not an isolated work. The series of seascapes painted in Brittany in the late 1890s leaves us in no doubt that the style he developed evolved from his ability to recognise and absorb the extraordinary developments which were happening around him. However, it did not stop with landscapes and seascapes. With equal force, his expressiveness comes to the fore in figure paintings such as Paysan Breton, or the peasant woman, countrywoman, Breton countrywoman, a seminal work in which O'Connor takes the doctrine of simplicity to the extreme. The main body of the painting is constructed in a fashion similar to the Les Avants work, whereby an amalgamation of heavy stripes are laid over a stained canvas. Now, to see a close-up of similar style to this work, it might interest you to know that the Hunt Museum here in Limerick has a painting called Fair Trees, which is unfinished but which is epitomised and representative of O'Connor's style of painting. The striped paintwork that we see here is also seen in Fir Trees, if you want to have a look at it in the Hunt Museum. The background is represented by long, bold, isolated stripes applied to a strong pink stain, which graduates from light to dark. You can see that. It's moving along here from light to dark. The deep pinks are mirrored in the face and neck, where no attempt is made to fill in detail. So even though it's not a detailed painting, you're still able to see that it is a Breton woman. You're still able to make out her features, even though they seem blurred, but they're still, recognizable as a face. The same can be said of the hands painted in strong orange colour. This minimalist technique produces an energy seldom found in formal realist paintings. So when we're talking about realist paintings, we're talking about exactly that you can see every detail in a painting, in the fingers, in the eyes. Even though that's not here, you're still able to see that it is hands and it is a face. Now this is more what you'd think of as a representative painting. And these are, again, examples in the Hunt Museum. O'Connor has Breton painting of a woman. This is a particular favourite of mine, going back to his kind of expressionist style in Orchard and Mountain. You can see certainly influences of Van Gogh and Gauguin in this painting here. The colours are beautiful. There's no particular detail within the painting, but you can still realise that it is a field or orchard with the mountains in the background. Now the next artist we're going to talk about is Walter Osborne. He would be regarded, I suppose, as the most, or as the closest, we should say, to the French Impressionist paintings, and that his subject matter was the light, the transience of light within his paintings, and the fact that he had beautiful images as well contributed to the fact that these paintings are very popular. Walter Osborne then, unlike his counterparts who went to France, went to Antwerp to study under the tutelage of Charles Berlat, who was professor of painting at the Académie Royale from 1878 to 1885. Before Paris became the art capital of the world in the last quarter of the 19th century, Irish artists looked to other continental cities for their training, and Antwerp was the third oldest art school in Europe. Verlat held a strong position when it came to carefulness in drawing, stating that his pupils had to draw what they see, don't draw what isn't there, and he taught them to handle paint vigorously so that one was drawing and painting at the same time. He was probably the best known Belgian painter of this period and the most cosmopolitan, who had a big influence over one of the few Irish artists that could be possibly termed Impressionist in its recognised form. That's what I explained, and that was Walter Osborne. This was the main lesson learned from both Antwerp and Paris. Irish students were above all else taught to draw, and this careful drawing underlined Osborne's more impressionist style of painting. Here we have Apple Gathering at Quimperle, and this is among his best loved paintings. It depicts two girls in traditional Breton dress gathering apples in the orchards with the rooftops of Quimperle visible in the background. What distinguishes Osborne from his contemporaries is his love of children. The girl who reaches up for the apples has been termed plain-faced by some art historians and art critics, and ordinary, but he gives her an endearing quality. He uses rich greens, greys and slate blues with touches of pink to enhance the effect. So you can see these touches of pink even on the rooftops, down here on the bottom among the leaves that are falling on the ground. Osborne's naturalism aspired to the freshness of someone who was observing the world with an innocent eye, which perhaps explains why simple scenes like apple gathering can hold such an appeal to the viewer. Despite this high degree of naturalism and actual process of painting, the actual process of painting is quite deliberate. So again, it's almost as if he's come upon this scene come upon this scene spontaneously, but he has deliberately set it up to have its best effect. The painting is quite deliberate. He uses the square brush technique of Aloysius O'Kelly to model the tree trunk in the foreground. Now what I mean by that is you can have various types of brushes. You can have your round head brush or a square head, flat head brush. So what he does is he uses his flat head brush and he builds up the structure and form of the tree like that, and that was also seen in the paintings of Aloysius O'Kelly. His composition is deceptively simple: an orchard in the foreground, a town in the background, and both areas linked by the upward sweep of the tree, it's linking the two of them, and the two girls' positions, one on the left and one on the right. So it's deliberately set up. And as you can see, this one is behind this one, so you get that sense of perspective as well. Now another favourite is feeding the chickens. So just move on. Feeding the chickens features in a letter to his father while the artist was working at North Littleton near Stratford upon Avon in Warwickshire, in which he writes that he is pretty far advanced on a Kit Kat of a girl feeding fowl in a sort of farmyard. From the mid-1880s to 1890, Osborne visited small towns, villages and harbours in England and painted local people tending livestock, feeding chickens and ploughing fields. So you can see the subject matter is quite simple, quite natural, quite innocent, but he produces a lovely, beautiful visual finished product that draws the viewer in, and it's a pleasant painting that you would not get tired of looking at. Now this is one of his best known paintings and it's in the National Gallery in Ireland. It's in the Phoenix Park, Light and Shade. In 1892, Osborne returned to Ireland to live in the family residence, and he also had a studio at number 7 St. Stephen's Green. He spent a considerable amount of time painting outdoors in Dublin around St. Patrick's Cathedral or in the countryside. He was well liked in social circles and counted the surgeon Sir Thornley Stoker, brother of Bram Stoker, among his best friends. Osborne's understanding and sympathetic nature is especially prevalent in a series of street scenes which he continued to work on when he returned to Ireland. Here, his sensitivity to the poor and children is fully realised. Remember I said that he liked painting children? You can see the sensitivity here in which he has painted them. This painting demonstrates his humanity and powerful compassion mixed with his social realism. There is increasing amounts of sunlight and shadow as it moves from left to right. You can see that. The sunlight is coming in here through. It's much darker over here. Perhaps his preference for working out of doors, which brought spontaneity, light and atmosphere to his work, was the closest he really got to Impressionism. The paint is applied freely and the reflected light plays upon the faces, emphasising the hopeful gaze of the young boy, here, the more resigned air of his mother, she looks lost in her own world, the melancholy stare of the old man, who's looking directly at the viewer, and finally the downcast despair of the man with his arms folded, hidden in shadow on the far right, while the sunlit foliage behind the figures, here, stands out from the wall in the background to create a sense of space. So again we get the sense of perspective from the background here. The painting, in sense, is a social document. The overall impression made by it is of rest and tranquility. Here is a world, a way of life, a class system even, which has existed unchanged for many generations. Yet Osborne is content to allow his viewers to bring our own observations to the scene and form our own judgments and opinions. So we can kind of make up our own stories about the woman and the children just by looking at this, trying to think of what her life is like. And why is she sitting out here? Are these related to her? What is the relationship? Again, like Frank O'Mara, Walter Osborne died at a relatively young age of 43, and you can see some of his work in the Hugh Lane Gallery in Dublin. Now the final artist I'm going to have a look at is William Leech. This is one of his best known paintings and his most beloved paintings. In 1901, Leech travelled to Paris and enrolled at the famous Académie Julian and remained there for 2 years. Thereafter, until 1917, he lived largely at Carcagnou in Brittany, although he often made visits home and exhibited regularly in Dublin. His output consists mainly of coastal and harbour scenes, landscapes, interiors, still life and portraits. Later in life he developed a distinctive style which is immediately recognisable, employing his own carefully thought out principles and ideas, particularly in his approach to perspective. I'll talk about that in a minute. Some of his contemporaries recognised this unique quality and were influenced by his work. So as I said, this is one of his most famous paintings, National Gallery of Ireland, a Covent Garden, Brittany. In the distribution of light, this painting displays some of the formal treatment and technique that Leech learned in his early days under Osborne. So he's actually a pupil of the previous artist, Walter Osborne. The composition is most likely a recapturing of the garden at the hospital and convent of the Sisters of the Holy Ghost in Concarneau, where Leech recuperated after a bout of typhoid fever in 1904. The picture is therefore partly autobiographical, but it is also a soliloquy, the artist anticipating his forthcoming marriage, his bride-to-be being the main figure in the composition. This lady here. He married Serene Elizabeth Curlin in 1912, but unfortunately they separated after a few years. But here she is dressed in the traditional Breton bridal costume and is compared to a novice of the church about to enter into a lifetime's commitment. But as she had previous marriage and was divorced, such a traditional ceremony would not take place on this occasion. So they actually married in a registry office, but he's kind of playing on the whole idea of that she's entering into a new life. The main figure, her Elizabeth here, is to the right of centre, which is a bold composition as it draws the viewer's eye. So he's kind of diverted our eyes from the centre here and have moved her over here. And in the foreground, as you can see, this foliage is very much influenced by work from, say, Van Gogh. If you look at Van Gogh's irises, you see that same kind of emphasis on the foreground, that Leech is creating this sense of perspective within the painting. She's to the right of the composition and she's about to exit the composition. And the evocation of tranquility and contemplation are dominant themes to this painting. Besides the theatricality of the pose and the manipulation of the light, Leech's vigorous brushstrokes provoke a sense of restlessness emphasized by the movement of flowers in the foreground. So like these are very loosely painted and there's a sense of movement to them in contrast to these here which seem very still, the figures seem very still. This is also further seen in the disharmony of whites and greens which stand out in sharp contrast against the bright yellow background. So the white and the yellow background are really emphasized because of the way he has kind of complemented the colours. So that's an interesting autobiographical painting of Leech's, and another featuring the same woman, his first wife. Sorry now, just trying to move on here. Okay, so the next painting featuring the same model, his first wife. Sorry. Okay, so this features again his first wife, Elizabeth Soran, and it's called Sunshade, and it's from 1911 to 1918. There's no specific date that we can pinpoint as to when exactly it was painting, but because it is featuring his his first wife, it must be between these dates. Leech's play of light and shade shows his impressionistic capability. The colouring of the green umbrella is reflected onto her yellow cardigan. Can you see that? The reflection of the green onto the yellow cardigan, so that it looks like the colour is actually bleaching through. This also occurs on her face. You see the green light reflected on her face, and her haughty air of detachment suggests a woman of independence caught up in her own thoughts and oblivious to the viewer. The splash of purple on the band of her hand breaks up, you can see the splash of purple here on the band of her hand, breaks up the monotony of greens and browns. Leech's rendering of her long tapered fingers accentuating the veins and knuckles, with one finger slightly caressing the other hand, aids to the sense of reverie. In other words, she's in a dream of her own. Now again, luckily enough here in Limerick, we have an example of Leech's work in the Hunt Museum. This is Susan Botterill, who actually was Leech's stepdaughter. So if you want to see work of any of these artists, we're very lucky in Limerick to know that the Hunt Museum has work by Roderick O'Connor, we have William Leech, and then the other works can be seen in our galleries in Dublin. So thank you very much for that, listening to that, and I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll talk to you again. Thank you, bye bye.